When YouTube recommended me Blues Run the Game, I clicked on it without knowing any backstory behind it or the artist. I listened and liked it enough to check this guy out. Why haven't I heard of him before? This tune was pretty good, and yes, the video didn't have too many listens, and the channel didn't look like it had that many clicks, but the song was still good. It seemed like it came straight from the early 60s, and definitely something that era was listening to. But why such a low view count? And where were the rest of his songs? I decided to go to his Wikipedia page, and I was completely blown back by his story. Hell, I was shocked by where he was born. I was born and raised and still live in Buffalo, New York. And when I saw he was too, I was surprised. Immediately, I felt some sort of connection and personal feeling. As I dug deeper into his life, the unfortunate truth came out. He went to Cleveland Hill Elementary School, which is just 3 miles away from where I sleep. This to me was such a weird, prideful feeling. It's not a great story to tell, but sadly, on Wednesday, March 31st, 1954, Jackson's life changed for the worse. He was involved in a deadly fire that happened at the school. The furnace exploded and claimed the lives of 15 sixth grade students. I don't know if the correct word for this horrible situation would be ironic, but the class that was going on while it happened was music class. Jackson suffered burns over 50% of his body and had additional issues damaging his glands, which resulted in major joint problems and pain. When digging into this, it became more and more personal, which is why I set out to make this video. My grandfather, who was a volunteer firefighter at the time, was driving with my grandmother on their way to a doctor's appointment for their newborn. He stopped to try to help out, but they wouldn't let him inside, as he didn't have any gear on. One of our local favorite restaurants, Alton's, honors a man who was in the fire and went there a lot. He had a limp and multiple burns. When Jackson was in the hospital, a teacher gave him an acoustic guitar to play while he healed. Jackson's idol was Elvis and attached himself to the guitar because of him. When Jackson was 14, he got to meet Elvis as a part of an event because of the fire. When Jackson turned 21, he got his insurance payout from the fire, which was just over $1 million in today's money. He decided to go overseas to England to find the folk scene. Jackson made a connection with Paul Simon, of Simon and Garfunkel. Garfunkel was there too, along with Al Stewart. They all shared a house together, and eventually Jackson recorded his only album, self-titled. Jackson was so nervous that they had to put up sheets around him to avoid him being looked down upon by the producing group. It was probably the strangest recording session I've ever been to, Stewart says. Even when Paul would say, "Okay, we're ready," often this would be followed by 2 or 3 minutes of total silence while Jackson psyched himself into singing, and then this beautiful guitar and voice would emerge. Despite this, the album was recorded in 6 hours, which is pretty quick for 10 songs, especially in that era. His biggest hit is Blues Run the Game, and that opens up the album. It truly sets the tone for this record. Jackson's finger-picking skills are nothing to scoff at, but it gets repetitive. If you skip the second track and go straight to the third, you'd think it's a continuation of Blues Run the Game. I hate to criticize the album because I feel for Jackson, but it's somewhat of a boring album that stays stuck in the 60s. I say this as an album as a whole. There's more than a few great songs on this album, but they're even better when they're on their own. The vibe I get from it even sounds like 50s music, which makes sense because Elvis was Jackson's idol. Yellow Walls is a great song and upbeat at times thanks to the additional guitar provided by Al Stewart. Milk and Honey is another big hit that was covered by many people and appears in the film The Brown Bunny. My Name is Carnival is another song that stands the test of time as it appeared in the 2019 movie Joker. I Want to Be Alone is in a movie by Daft Punk. I can't argue with its legacy and impact, as Blues Run the Game has been covered by a mixture of artists and appeared in many films as well. So don't get it twisted, I don't think the songs are bad. It's just a depressing album that hones in on Jackson's fingerpicking, which to me sounds great, but it doesn't have much variety, as after you hear all these songs back to back, you start to wish you had a different sound to listen to. Having said that, Don't Look Back has to be one of my favorites, as he's strumming in this one, and it has a structure that I'm used to. The album never made the charts and did not sell well. In today's time, Pitchfork gives it an 8 and AllMusic gives it a 4.5 stars. I have to be in the same ballpark and give it a 7 out of 10. If you're a fan of the 60s and folk music without a backing band, you'll give it a pretty decent review as well. After its release in December 1965, Jackson's life began to go downhill as his mental health was getting worse and he went for an evaluation. He went back to the States after his money ran out, but returned to England in 1968. After coming back, many of the folkies remembered him and he was able to find some work, but people noticed his change for the worse. Al Stewart said, "He proceeded to fall apart before our very eyes." With his health diminishing and little work to be found, he moved back to the States and went to Woodstock, where he married Elaine Sedgwick. Yep, Edie Sedgwick's cousin. He had a son and a daughter, but the bad things didn't stop as Jackson's son died and sent Jackson into a deep depression void, which landed him in a local hospital. In the early 70s, it got worse. The marriage was falling apart, and soon they got a divorce, which resulted in Jackson not being able to see his daughter, which only made his health worse. "My wife wouldn't let me see the one child who had lived. I had an emotional breakdown," Jackson said. He was then hospitalized and diagnosed with schizophrenia. Jackson did not agree with that. During this time, he tried to reach out to friends and even tried to re-release his album. John Renbourn, an English guitarist, said he got a letter from Jackson saying, "Here you're still playing and doing my numbers. It would be great to see you." It was rather touching, John said. It looked like it was typed on a typewriter that was all busted up because the keys were all over the place. The address was Simmons Court, Woodstock. John went to Woodstock looking for Jackson. Sometime later, John said, "I was told there was a guy who was odd, even by Woodstock standards, who went around looking at traffic lights," saying that was him. It's been told they only talked over the phone and met up later in Buffalo, with John saying, "He was very overweight, looked really wrecked. His eyes were all fucked up. He had some gizmo that he flipped around his head like an antenna. It was a shock to see him. But we sat around and all the old chat came back, and he was as easy as you like." Honestly, at this point, I think you have to give Jackson a little credit for not giving up. There was never any indication that Jackson hurt anybody or committed any crimes. He was a good guy. It sucks his mental issues couldn't be addressed properly. I would love to say we're done with this story, but we're not, and yeah, sadly, it gets worse. One source says he went to California for a bit, but ended up back with his parents sometime in the early 1980s. He moved to Elma. Yeah, I know that place too, about 20 minutes away. Then, in 1984, Jackson made a move. While his mom was in the hospital, Jackson set off to New York City. When his mom came home, there was no note. I wonder if his father was still around at this point. I'm going to guess not. His mom thought Jackson was dead, but he was not. Jackson made his way to New York City in searches of his old buddy, Paul Simon. But, to Jackson, Paul wasn't a buddy anymore. Some say Jackson went there because he felt Paul owed him royalties and had been suppressing his songs. This may be right, or maybe he just wanted to reconnect and get his music career back to light. Whatever reason is moot, because Jackson never found Paul and ended up homeless. He struggled due to his record of mental illness. He would be put in a hospital and come in and out of that lifestyle for the next 15 years. I couldn't make head nor tail of anything. I was living out of garbage pails and living on the street with a blanket. I would go through construction sites, dumpsters, and various other things, he says. He would go on to say, "I didn't have a guitar. I was being denied my rights. I was being told I was paranoid schizophrenic and treated for it, which I wasn't. It was all trauma-related." We are nearing the 1990s, but before we go further, we have to go back to 1983, because Jackson's luck would start to turn for the better just a little bit, and he didn't even know it. When he didn't have money, he had to sell some of his record collection. One of those records was The Year of the Cat. It charted well in the day for no other than Al Stewart. So one day, back in Woodstock in the 70s, Jackson sold this record with a handwritten note on the cover saying, "Regards to Jackson, the Blues run the game, Al." It was Al's handwriting as Al gave him the record and Al Jackson was forced to sell it to live. So in 1983, a local music enthusiast named Jim Abbott notices the note on the cover and wanted to investigate it. He asked the shopkeeper what was up, who then replied, "Jackson is the street guy who comes in." Unfortunately, Jackson wasn't around in the 80s. We know that because he was with his parents. So the fan Jim didn't investigate for a bit until a few years later when he sees a John Renbourn album. Talk about coming full circle. On this album is Jackson's song, Blues Run the Game. Jim notices this and buys the album. Another few years go by, and Jim is reading a biography of Paul Simon. And guess who makes an appearance? Jackson C. Frank. Put yourself in Jim's shoes, who didn't have the power of the internet or much to go on when trying to figure out Jackson's life. There's no way of knowing if Jim even knew Jackson was a diamond-in-the-rough folk singer. He files this as something that's very interesting, but not something he's totally seeking out. One day, years later in the early 90s, Jim is at a college in Woodstock, where he is talking to a teacher about folk music. Jim asks the teacher if he's ever heard of Jackson. The teacher replies, "Well, yes. As a matter of fact, I just got a letter from him." In the letter, it says, "Do you feel like helping a down-on-his-luck folk singer?" Sent from New York City while Jackson was in and out of hospital homes. Jim would go on to help Jackson, getting him into a senior citizen's home in Woodstock. He called Jackson and told him this. Jim would go to New York City to meet up with Jackson. He had nothing. It was really sad. We went and had lunch and went back to his room. It almost made me cry, because here was this 50-year-old man, and all he had to his name was a beat-up old suitcase and a broken pair of glasses. I guess his caseworker had given him a $10 guitar, but it wouldn't stay in tune. He tried to play Blues Run the Game for me, but his voice was pretty much shot. They would part ways for the moment after planning Jackson's move back to Woodstock. While awaiting the move back, Jackson would have one last shitty event happen to him. He was sitting on a bench looking homeless, but minding his own business, as a group of supposedly teenagers shot him in the eye with an air rifle. Jackson was at the wrong place at the wrong time, just like when he was in school. But still, that wouldn't stop Jackson. He kept going. With the help from Jim, Jackson moved back to Woodstock and actually started recording again. Jackson must have improved because Jim now says sometimes his voice doesn't sound too bad. He was now receiving royalty checks and seemed to be doing a bit better than what he came from. There wasn't much information after this, and there was no suggestion that he ever reconnected with his ex or daughter. But in 1999, Jackson decided 56 years was enough of suffering and died one day after his birthday on March 3rd, 1999. His heart gave out, and that's totally understandable. I couldn't imagine having a life like his and still living that late in life. There's so many other stories of musicians dying early because of issues like this, and they're usually dead before they're 40. Jackson made it to 56. Jim sold what he had of Jackson's to mostly an archivist and collector named Jeffrey Weiss, who provided most of this script as his information was the most accurate. And honestly, I didn't even notice this because the website didn't have any personal information until I saw the bottom. I didn't know it was Jeff he sold it to because I got that information from a different article and then connected a lot of things back to Jeff's blog post, which was published in the 1990s. On Jeff's website, it didn't even have any information about Jackson's death. So that's why I was using multiple articles and never realized it was Jeff who provided me with the best information this whole time. I clicked on Jeff's main page and found more photos and information about Jackson. Now, that totally blew my mind to have it come full circle for me too. Thank you, Jeff, for cataloging this. Jackson's story will hopefully live on as his core songs still continue to live in pop culture through covers and samples. And Jackson will live through me as I drive by his old school almost every day. I wish Jackson got the chance to be great. He never got a second album like others did. Bad luck followed him, but he kept going. No matter how bad it got for him, he kept going. That shows you something, how strong of a person he really was. Jackson is somewhat of a hero, a true lost folk hero. He battled through his trauma and recorded an album. He wasn't well known, but to the people that knew him, regarded him as one of the greatest. I'm so happy I made this video and found Jackson. Well, maybe he found me. And this has been personal for me. Understand that as I try to ramble through these last lines and make it sound hippie and maybe a little bittersweet, while probably tearing up just a tad. Jackson, you wrote one of the best songs in your era that continues to get exposure to this day. My friend, you stood the test of time. I hope your spirit feels comfort knowing that.